Welcome to our second video of the week. In the first video this week, we read through the introductory passage of Luke chapter 1, and the passage was primarily about the purpose of this gospel, an introduction to the gospel we're looking at. And if you watch the video with us, we made a list of questions, primarily questions like, who was Luke, the author of this gospel, and why did Luke write this gospel? What we want to do in this video, the pattern we'll fall into, the first video each week is asking questions, the second video midweek, this video is to begin answering those questions, and then this will be followed up by a reflection. But to guide our conversation today, I basically have the questions that we laid out in the first video. What makes Luke's gospel so unique, so different? And the first question we described that we wanted to explore was, who was Luke? Now, one of the things that might be surprising to you is Luke doesn't actually mention himself as the author of the Gospel of Luke. If you read the passage closely, while he mentions names like Theophilus, we'll talk about in a minute, and while he uses the pronoun I, he doesn't describe who he is, like we often get in some of Paul's letters, perhaps, where he might at the beginning or end describe himself who is writing. Luke, nowhere in the Gospel of Luke says specifically that he wrote it. So how do we know that Luke is the writer? Well, it's a very old tradition, one of the oldest traditions, and although many of the New Testament books have debates among scholars about who the author was, this is one that there's pretty general agreement on. A few of the sources that might be helpful for understanding. There is an old document called the Bodmore Papyrus, and it's basically one of the oldest manuscripts of the New Testament we have. Almost all of the Gospel of Luke is included, and it describes the author of that Gospel, the third Gospel, as being Luke. And this document goes all the way back to perhaps sometime between 175 to 25 AD. So one of the oldest versions of, or portions of the Old Testament, almost all of Luke it included, it describes Luke as being the author. So that tradition of Luke being associated with this third gospel, Luke as the author, is a really, really old one. We also have other places like the Muratorian canon. So this is a fragment, and it's actually an older list that's believed to be a copy or a translation of a much, much older list of New Testament books. So a list of all of the books that were included in the New Testament canon. And when it comes specifically to the third gospel, what we call Luke's gospel, it records the third book of the gospel is that according to Luke. Luke, the well-known physician after the ascension of Christ, when Paul had taken with him as one zealous for the law, composed it in his own name according to belief. Yet he himself had not seen the Lord in the flesh, and therefore, as he was able to ascertain events, so indeed he begins to tell the story from the birth of John. So there's a few things that are really important in that description. Number one, again, this goes back to perhaps 170 AD, so a very old tradition that's associating not only the name Luke, but this particular character. Luke is a physician, Luke is a companion of Paul. We're going to look at these in more detail in a moment. And as you might have seen from our introduction as we were reading the passage itself, this Muratorian canon specifically talks about Luke's unique approach of having not been an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, but him having obtained this information from his study and interviews. You could also add to this, I'm giving you two examples of some of the earliest associations of Luke's name with this specific third gospel. But we could spend quite a bit more time on this, from Irenaeus to Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, as we mentioned, the Muratorian canon. All of these regard Luke as being the author of both Luke and Acts. So there's almost universal consensus, not only from scholars, but from the oldest sources and the oldest scholars, that Luke was in fact the author. Now, there are actually some evidence in Scripture itself. I think it's always helpful when outside sources confirm it, but of course I'm most predisposed to interest in what does the Scriptures actually say. And I want to look at some of that scriptural support. So what is the scriptural evidence we have for Luke being the author of Luke and ultimately this 2-volume work, Luke and Acts? So a few verses we can look at to get a better sense of who Luke was. So from the book of Philemon, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends greetings to you. This is Paul writing. And so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. So Paul in the book of Philemon is specifically referring to a Luke, who is one of his fellow workers. From Colossians 4, Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas. This is Paul again. And here, not only does he talk about Luke being one of his companions who's greeting the church, but here he describes Luke as a physician, which again corresponds to those early church sources that we have. Then Paul writing from prison, 2 Timothy chapter 4, one of the later writings of Paul's life. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Luke alone is with me. So Paul's describing Luke not only as a companion, but according to 2 Timothy 4, maybe one of the most faithful companions, one who was with him even while he was in prison, somebody who knew Paul personally well. There are also places that lead us to believe within the actual text of Luke and Acts, where Luke may be hinting about himself being the author. Again, he never describes himself specifically by saying, I, Luke, am writing. But there's a place that I believe, I'm convinced, as well as many other scholars, that Luke does show up in the passage. So we read from Acts. Remember, Luke was originally written, and we can see this as we get to the end of Luke, the beginning of Acts, but Luke and Acts is a kind of 2-volume work. Specifically, Acts refers to Luke. It also refers to Theophilus in its opening, so we know they're connected. But we read in Acts chapter 16, this is during Paul's missionary journeys, when he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go out to Macedonia, concluding that the Lord had called us to preach the good news to them. Now, what's unique about this is, so far in Acts is all written in the third person. It's about people like Peter and about Paul. But all of a sudden, when you get to Acts chapter 16, in the middle of one of Paul's missionary journeys, you start getting this we pronoun that shows up. That the author, at least that's the most literal reading, is now including himself in the stories. So if you look at the rest of them from Acts 16 we just read, if you go on to Acts 20, but these had gone ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. We sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, Acts 21, when we had departed from them and set sail, Acts 27, when it was determined that we should sail for Italy. What you get is you get these passages from Acts where the author seems to now be a participant in those events. If you go back to the passages from elsewhere in Paul's letters, we know that this Luke, who was a physician, was an associate of Paul's, who was apparently traveling and well known amongst the churches, that was spending time with Paul. And so it fits really well as we get into Paul's missionary journeys in Acts, that all of a sudden we start getting the author, Luke, who's describing himself, as Paul describes him elsewhere, a companion, someone who shows up on these trips. According to the reading of Acts, what seems to have happened is Paul would have been with others on his first missionary journey, but on his second missionary journey, probably somewhere around Troas, I have cited here on the map, Luke would have become a participant in those trips and may have participated in all of the remaining events of Paul's missionary journeys and even have been with him there in prison at the end. And so what you're going to get is you're going to get not only good evidence for Acts, that Luke himself lived through many of the events he's recording, but you also get a strong indication that he would have had access to not only all of Paul's eyewitness events, testimony, but he would have been introduced to all of the associates and many of the leaders of the church that will become the basis, the eyewitness testimony for Luke as he's recording his gospel. So a little bit already, we're starting to stack up some things about Luke, even as we're exploring from the scriptures. So what do we know? We know that he was a traveling companion of Paul. We know that he was a physician. Those are both true from the scriptures themselves, as well as attested from some of those early sources. But I think there's a good third question to ask about, was then Luke a Jew or a Gentile? This is actually a somewhat debated passage. It's debated because Luke seems, as we'll talk about in a little bit in more detail, he seems to be primarily fluent, or at least have a high level of education in Greek. When he quotes from scriptures, he tends to quote from the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. His Greek writing style seems to be of a high education. But he also seems to have really in-depth knowledge. One of the things you're going to see as we work through Luke's gospel is how often he's alluding, in often very artful ways, to the Old Testament, to Old Testament prophecies. He seems to have also really understood the rabbinic debates that were taking place. We're going to see this in more detail in a moment. But I do tend to take the view that Luke was most likely a Gentile. And again, I think there's some evidence from Scripture itself. I want to show you that passage. So from Colossians chapter 4. So again, Paul is writing, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you received commandments. If he comes to you, receive him. And Jesus, who is called Justus. These are my only fellow workers of God's kingdom who are of the circumcision, men who have been a comfort to me. Now, what Paul seems to be saying is these are Jewish companions, those of circumcision who have been serving with him. Then Paul goes on to say, Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ, salutes you, always striving for you in his prayers, that you may stand perfect and complete in all of the will of God. For I testify about him that he has great zeal for you, and for those in Laodicea, and for those in Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. So, if Paul is describing his companions in this passage, and if he's beginning in the first group of companions by saying, these are the circumcised, the Jewish, and then he goes on to describe additional companions, most scholars think that what he's doing is he's putting Luke within that category of Gentile colleagues, those who are traveling with him that are Gentiles. And I think that's probably the right reading of this passage, that Luke fits in, like Demas and the others described here, Epaphras, as Gentile Christians who are serving with Paul. But as I mentioned before, the big question that sort of goes unanswered there is Luke's in-depth knowledge of the Old Testament and of Jewish tradition. Luke is a master of the Old Testament, although as I mentioned, particularly in the Septuagint, that's this LXX, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. One of the options is Luke could have been considered one of the God-fearers, a Gentile who perhaps could have even practiced the Jewish faith before becoming a Christian. But one of the things I actually take away from this is it is possible for Luke as a Gentile who is passionate about recording the history of the Christian church, writing a gospel of Jesus' ministry. It's possible that as a Gentile, he has studied and learned the manners and customs of the time of Jesus, of the rabbinic debates, of the kind of Jewish society Jesus was in. I mean, remember, we said Luke was going around recording eyewitness testimony. And the reason I think this is important is it is possible, you don't have to be a Jew, to take seriously the Jewish writings, the Jewish traditions and customs, to learn those things as a way of better understanding Jesus, of better understanding the context of Jesus' ministry. It also means that even as a Gentile New Testament believer, Luke seems to have been passionate about studying and understanding the Old Testament and understanding how all of the prophecies in the Old Testament story is fulfilled in Christ. So if anything, I want to offer to you as an encouragement, like Luke, if you want to really take seriously Jesus' story and the New Testament Gospels, like him, it really requires us to take up the work of really understanding the Old Testament, of really understanding the Jewish faith, particularly in the time and the moment of Jesus. And Luke is going to be such an incredible example of how that can be done. So again, what have we learned about Luke so far? Well, Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. He was a physician, educated both probably not only in the medical field, but also obviously extremely literate in Greek and well-studied. He's a great researcher and writer. And he's most likely a Gentile who may have had some faith in the Jewish God prior to his conversion to Christianity, but for sure is now interested in that topic, having become a follower of Christ and a companion of Paul's. Well, that brings us to our second question, a little bit about who Luke specifically is. But as we were outlining questions earlier this week, the second question we asked was, why does Luke write this gospel? There are, after all, in the New Testament, 4 gospels. And I think one of the things that's really helpful is to begin to understand and ask, what is unique about each of these gospels? And why does Luke specifically feel the need to write this gospel? I want to give you a little bit of a timeline. And we're moving into a category where there's going to be a lot of debates around dates. Generally, there's consensus about which gospel came first and the authorship of those gospels. But here I wanted to show you, before we get into the dates, I wanted to show you the length. So what we're looking at in this diagram is we're basically looking at how long, at the top of each of these bars, is the number of words, or how long the gospel is. So Mark, the first of our gospel accounts, Mark is primarily recording, according to tradition, the eyewitness account of Peter. Mark is just over 11,000 words. Matthew, I put an asterisk by it, Matthew is an eyewitness himself of Jesus' ministry. Matthew's gospel is just over 18,000 words. Luke, who, remember again, is not an eyewitness, but claims in the introduction of the Gospel of Luke that he's gathering eyewitness testimony through research to write this orderly account. Luke's Gospel is by far the longest, 19,000, almost 19,500 words. If you combine that with Acts, these two books written together as two volumes, well, then you actually have 28% of the New Testament included in Luke and Acts. John's Gospel being 15,000, just over 15,000 words. So Luke's Gospel is by far the longest, particularly if you add the early church accounts of Acts into it as well. But I think it's significant because Luke is giving us something really comprehensive. As I mentioned before, I want to look at the dates. These are hotly debated among scholars. I tend to take the more conservative view and believe that the synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, that these were written before 70 AD. 70 AD is an important date. We'll talk about it in future study as well, too, because it marks the destruction, the siege and destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. And I do believe most of the New Testament, with possibly the exception of some of John's writings, were written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. There are many scholars with opposing views on that. But as one point of reference, the book of Acts ends with Paul still in prison. Paul will ultimately be executed in Rome under Roman authority. And there are arguments, literary arguments, for why Luke may want to end the story of Acts with Paul in prison but not yet killed. But I tend to think Luke is writing Acts before the death of Paul, or else he would have included that, particularly Acts, the second half, being so much about Paul's life and ministry. So all that to say, really the most important point here is most scholars agree that Mark was the earliest, followed by Matthew, which would have been written after, and sometime in that similar time period, close to it at least, Luke, and then Acts after Luke was written. And it seems likely, most scholars also agree that Luke would have had access to Mark. He would have known about Mark's gospel and perhaps other writings as well. So there's scholars will often talk about what's called a Q document, or a source. It may have been written or it may have just been tradition, but a collection of Jesus's sayings or words that have been passed down, that these synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they seem to be drawing from a similar source. And so Luke probably knows about Mark, probably knows about these other sources, may have even known about Matthew. And I think you see that show up in an important way. So if we read from the passage we were reading this week, if we read just what Luke says at the beginning, verses 1 through 3, since many have undertaken to set in order a narrative concerning those matters which have been fulfilled among us. I mean, look, Luke is saying by his own words, at the very first sentence of his gospel, I know that some have already set out to write about Jesus and the things that have been passed on to you. I mean, number one, there it is. Many have undertaken to set an order. He may be here specifically even alluding to writers like Mark or Matthew. So Luke is well aware that his gospel is not the only gospel. It's not the first gospel. That when he's writing, what he's doing is he's contributing to an existing body of writings that others have undertaken. But he also says, number two, Luke decides that he is going to add to it. Verse 3, it seemed good to me also. So in addition to those gospel accounts he knows about, Luke acknowledges, I also had my own reasons, my own desire. It seemed good to me that I would add to those written accounts. A third thing I think we can see about what is unique about his gospel, Luke will base his gospel on eyewitness testimony. Those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word delivered them to us. So whereas Mark is primarily going to be about capturing Peter's eyewitness account, where both Matthew and John are writing from their own perspective as eyewitnesses themselves, Luke tells us very specifically that he is writing his gospel based on research and eyewitness testimony, which may account for the fact that Luke's gospel is the longest of the four gospels. It has the most material because he's really going and doing research to gather all of this testimony. The final piece of this, it will be a full and ordered account, is the way that he says it, having traced the course of all these things accurately from the first to write to you in order. That Luke feels in some way that his gospel is going to be structured and ordered in a unique way. And that because of his research and the eyewitness testimony he's gathering, that he is, by my reading of this, giving us what he considers a fuller, or not to say that the others were inaccurate, but he's wanting to give the most accurate, fullest depiction of Jesus's ministry, particularly then into Acts as it continues into the early church. So it's why you're going to get High Greek, you're going to get really great allusions to the Old Testament, the complexities of the culture around Jesus. I mean, there's a reason it's the longest gospel. He's really done his homework to try and make this a full account. I want to look just a little bit more about this idea, this accurate or this orderly account. I've been reading from the World English Bible, to write to you in order. The King James Version has it, to write unto thee in order. The ESV, I actually think, has probably my favorite version of this translation, to write an orderly account for you. This is what Luke is setting out to do. This was our question. Why does Luke want to add? Why does he write his gospel? Well, for him, he specifically tells us it's to provide an orderly account, or one scholar describes it. The word implies the continuity of items within a logical whole, that he is trying to do something comprehensive in his writing. And there's actually some pretty good evidence of this. As we work through Luke's gospel, I'll be pointing these things out. But while all of the gospels do really incredible things and have really unique features to them, certainly one of the unique features of Luke's gospel is the evidence of the research and the logical mind in both organizing the material, but also in selecting material. So as we read from Luke's gospel, you're going to see things like this. Luke mentions over 130 places by name. So he's giving us detailed descriptions of where things happen. In the book of Acts, Luke mentions 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 Mediterranean islands. So when we talk about research or him gathering information, I mean, you can see it. He's giving us this extremely ordered account. He also lists 95 people not by name, 62 of which are not named elsewhere in the New Testament. So when Luke tells us that he's doing this based on eyewitness testimony, there seems to be a good indication that that testimony, that research he's been gathering is pretty thorough. He's giving us the names and the places as a researcher or somebody we would expect doing research to do. Now, all of this is how Luke is telling us the story. So this is the how he's going about his work. But the question we're also been trying to ask is, why does he tell us this story? Why is it that Luke is motivated to do this? Not just how he's going to do it, but why he's going to do it. And to get at this question, I want to read a source. As we get further into our study, you're often going to have me quoting from Josephus. He's a really important writer, a contemporary of Jesus and these events in the early church. And there'll be a supplementary mini course that will give you all of the sort of literature of the period, and we'll have a whole section in there on Josephus. So I'm not going to spend too much time explaining it now. But I do want to look at Josephus as a historian when he sets out to write. He does something similar to Luke in that he lays out the reasons in which he's writing his history, in Josephus's case, his history of the Jews. But in a similar way, he begins by saying why he's taking up this work. And I think it's very similar to what Luke is doing, although what Josephus writes is a little bit longer. So Josephus writes, "Those who undertake to write histories do not, I perceive, take the trouble on one and the same account, but for many reasons." So different people take up the work of writing history for different reasons. And those such as are very different from one another. So he gives some examples. Number one, for some of them apply themselves to this part of learning to show their skill in composition, and that they may therein acquire a reputation for speaking finely. Some people take up the work of writing history because they want to be great writers and show their ability at rhetoric and writing, he says. Then he gives a second reason. Others of them there are who write histories in order to gratify those that happen to be concerned in them, and on that account have spared no pains, but rather go beyond their own abilities in this performance. Josephus says some people will write histories to flatter the people who are involved. Number three, but others there are who, of necessity and by force, are driven to write history because they are concerned in the facts, and so cannot excuse themselves from committing them to writing for the advantage of posterity. So some write because they want to record the truth for the future. And he says, nay, number four, there are not a few who are induced to draw their historical facts out of darkness into light and to produce them for the benefit of the public on account of the great importance of the facts themselves with which they have been concerned. So this fourth perspective, Josephus says, are those who want to offer to the public history and facts that might otherwise be lost. The truth might be covered up. They want to offer a writing or an explanation of history that could be lost. Now, of these several reasons for writing history, I must profess the two last were my own reasons. So Josephus very clearly tells us at the beginning of his book, The Antiquity of the Jews, the History of the Jews, why he is writing. He's writing, number one, he says, because he wants to be able to pass this history on for future generations. And number two, because he wants to draw things out of the unknown or the darkness so that they might be recorded. Well, what does Luke say? Does he give us anything like this in the introductory paragraph we read for why he specifically is telling this story? Well, it's much shorter, but I think he does. So Luke will say, that you, this is his reason for writing this orderly account, that you, Theophilus, might know the certainty concerning the things in which you were instructed. Now, this is, I think, perhaps the most important passage or the sentence from this introduction, and it's something I want to spend time reflecting on in our next video. But Luke is very specific that his reason for writing is so that Theophilus might have certainty about the things in which he had been taught, in which the things he had learned about Jesus and the Christian faith, that through this gospel that Luke is recording, through all of this work of research and all of this work of gathering eyewitness testimony, that there might be a kind of certainty or a security to the things in which Theophilus had learned about Christ. Now, the next thing we had specifically written down was we wanted to better understand who Theophilus was. If this was Luke's reason for writing, then Theophilus seems to be a pretty important piece of this question. A couple of options. Theophilus may very well have been Luke's benefactor. If it's true that Luke is traveling all over the Roman Empire, right? If he's not only gathering Jesus' stories from the land of Israel, but he's also gathering all of the stories of Acts across all of these missionary journeys. And if he's interviewing as many people as he mentions in his Gospels to gather all of these, I mean, this is an immense research project that would have not only taken time, it would have taken resources. There was costs associated with his time and his travel. And so it's possible that Theophilus was a benefactor, somebody from the early church who may have had wealth, who was funding the work that Luke was doing to record all of this history. I like this idea because I think writers should have benefactors. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if for whatever project you were taking on, there was somebody there who would help fund it. In fact, this happens a lot today. People give to charities and nonprofits. There are writers as well as documentary makers who do their work for nonprofit, and they have people who give or support the work they're doing. And that's one of the options. Theophilus may have been a benefactor. But there's a second option. Theophilus may have been a kind of literary device that Luke was using. This name Theophilus means a friend of God or loved or befriended by God. I put the Greek here, theos and philos. So these ideas that Theophilus is a friend of God, this may be a general way of Luke saying that the gospel is being written for anyone who is a friend of God, anyone who has been befriended by God. That is any believer who's looking to have greater certainty or assurance of the things that they've learned. So I think both of those are interesting ideas, and both could actually be true. It is possible there could have been a benefactor, and Luke specifically trying to address this book to any believer. But the main idea here is we're going to reflect more on in the future is this idea that Luke is writing so that there might be greater certainty about the things of Christ. Now, our next question that we had outlined was, why is Luke a good place to start? I mean, if you're joining us and participating in Let's Talk Bible, it's a pretty big pitch. I've asked you to spend the better part of the next year studying one book of the Bible, and I've promised you that from this time you'll invest in one book of the Bible, you're going to learn more about the rest of the Bible, about the background of the Bible, that this is the right approach to studying seriously the Bible. We're going to go all in on Luke. Well, I've made a selection there. So why Luke? Why do I think Luke is such an important place for us to study? And there's a few reasons that I think are based on some of what we've already discussed. Number one, Luke has researched and carefully ordered his gospel. That is, Luke is giving us what he says is an ordered and researched account of Jesus's life. So if we're looking for a place to study, it makes sense to study where somebody has gone about doing an in-depth or comprehensive study for us. So the logic of Luke's gospel, I think, makes it a great place for us to get serious about Bible study. Number two, Luke has a rich understanding of the Old Testament, and he uses it constantly, alluding to it, quoting it, drawing from it, as well as the backgrounds and customs of Jesus' time. He gathers all of this material and uses it to help give a deeper, richer presentation of Jesus. And so it's going to be a helpful place for us. As we're studying Luke's gospel, we will inevitably have to study the time period, the rabbinic conversations, the literature. We'll have to study the Old Testament prophets, the Old Testament stories. We'll constantly be being pulled into those things. Well, number 3, it's the most comprehensive account through to the early days of the church. What we get in Luke's gospel will be from before Jesus is born, John the Baptist, the prediction of John the Baptist's birth, all the way through to not only Jesus's death and resurrection and ascension, but also that transition into the early church itself. And if you continue with us, Luke will transition straight into the early church, into the story of Acts. So not only is Luke the longest of the Gospels, but it's really, by his own writing, a pretty comprehensive presentation of Jesus. Number 4, Luke contains some of Jesus's most well-known stories, so things like the parable of the prodigal son, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Some of the most famous sections of Jesus' teaching show up in Luke, but Luke also includes some of the most perplexing parables and teachings as well. So that is, we'll both get to explore things perhaps you're already familiar with, but see them from a new angle, and we'll be forced to contend with some really hard teachings, some difficult passages that Luke includes as well. So we get a lot of material in Luke that I think will be helpful for understanding Jesus. So that gets us at the heart of hopefully understanding a little bit more about what we set out from this first reading. Who was Luke? How does Luke go about writing his gospel? Why does Luke write his gospel? What does he hope that will be accomplished by the writing of his gospel? And it sets us up to reflect. Every week, the pattern, we're going to read the passage of Scripture. After we read the passage of Scripture and ask questions of it, we're going to study to try to answer those questions. And then we want to step back and reflect on the meaning of the passage. This week, what does it mean for us, as Luke has promised, to find greater security, to find a greater confidence, a certainty in the things that we've heard about Jesus for this next year that we're going to spend working through Luke's gospel? Perhaps take some time to think about it yourself, and we'll be back together to reflect on it in more detail.